Good evening, everyone. I'm going to give just a minute for people to trickle in, and then we'll get started. If you are just arriving, you'll see just a short welcome poll launch. There'll be another one at the end. I'm going to start in just about 30 seconds here. All right, we're going to slowly get the ball rolling. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining tonight. My name is Tal Kitron with Appleruth Tutoring Services. I'm an elite tutor doing mostly SAT, ACT, and PSAT prep, and a few other little things, and then executive function coaching, which I've been doing for a few years. Today, we're going to talk about the digital SAT strategies, all sorts of good stuff. I'll have you out of here within an hour, and we'll definitely leave some time for questions and answers at the end. You should have seen a little poll pop up, so if you don't mind filling that out, then you can close it out. Should be closed captioning available, that feature if you need to click it on the Zoom bar. And without further ado, let's get started. So here's what we're covering today. We're going to look at the format of the digital SAT. I say digital because all SATs are now on the computer. We're going to look at the verbal content as well as major strategies, and same for math. And throughout, I'll kind of sprinkle in techniques just from my experience as a tutor that you can immediately apply to either your practice or even official SAT if you're taking it in a few weeks. Next SAT is August 23rd for a lot of us. So let's just kind of get started with the scoring and the structure of the test. What you should expect, and this is very much like the PSAT that students take at school, but what you should expect is a verbal module, which is not a set form, but kind of a lower level module. And then depending on how you do, you get to module 2, upper level or lower level. And I'll talk more about that later. So this is an adaptive test, section adaptive. And then third section, after about a 10-minute break, is a math module. Depending on how you do, you'll then get to upper level or lower level module 2. We always want to be in upper level. We want it to be more difficult because your score floor is higher, as well as your ceiling. 400 is the lowest you can score just for showing up. 1600 is perfect SAT score, very rare. And it's because verbal's out of 800 as well as math. They're added together, and then you have your total score. For those asking, yes, this recording will be shared. I believe they send it out on Fridays. So this is being recorded and will be shared at the end. But do feel free to take notes and put questions in the Q&A, and I'll get to those at the very end. So always 4 sections, no writing portion, right? The reading and writing is really just reading comprehension and grammar, which we'll talk about shortly. So I mentioned adaptive. The question is, what does that mean? It is not question adaptive. So you shouldn't expect, like on section 1, depending on how you do, the questions get harder. That's not how it works. Sections 2 and 4 definitely will change based on how you perform, but will adapt only in one of 2 ways, either on average easier, so the lower level module for module 2 or 4, or harder. Because of this, or relatedly, earlier questions on that first module for verbal and the third section, which is module 1 for math, those questions are worth more. So if you miss a few questions on module 1, that's not necessarily the same as missing the same amount on module 2. For students aiming for a very high, near perfect score, pretty much need to be perfect on modules 1 and 3, just because those questions, if you miss them, it's maybe 20, 30 points as opposed to 10 on the second module. If you get to module 2 and you're finding things very easy, it's like, oh gosh, I know all this vocabulary, or man, this math is easier than the last section. It's not a great sign. We can't really do much about it, so you don't want to sweat that. But generally that would mean we're in the lower level module. And then about the highest you can probably score is 11 something, 1150 maybe out of 1600. Whereas if you make it to the upper levels, it's hard to score much below that, even if you do very poorly. So again, based on how you do on modules 1, verbal, and module 3, math, the second and fourth modules will be harder or easier. That's a pretty big change from past standardized tests. So some of the basics and major changes that have happened over the past couple of years since they've transitioned to the digital test. It's relatively short. This used to be 3.5 hours or so longer with the essay portion. Now, even with breaks, it's 2 hours and 24 minutes. There's more time than there has been in the past to answer questions. So it's less of a time crunch, though that still does exist, especially on the second module. Reading and writing, as we mentioned, is now combined. And really, there are very few grammatical concepts, like 5 or 6, whereas it used to be about a dozen. Gone are the days of long reading passages. They are now short, 1 paragraph, 2 max. And on the math, there's a graphing calculator built in, and you can use your own TI, 80, whatever throughout. So there's no calc section like there used to be. These are all good changes. I think people have been happy with them. Of course, having a shorter test and more time per question, that's always going to be a good thing for students and test takers. So here's the format itself, and then we'll get into some question types and specific strategies we can use. Each verbal module is 27 questions, and you only get 32 minutes. That is why module 2 upper level is usually the biggest time issue for people. Because 27 questions, if they're mostly simple, fine. But then if you kind of take 2-3 minutes on a question or two, then all of a sudden we're stuck for time at the end. Math, less so, 22 questions, 35 minutes. Most of those are multiple choice, but some free response, which we'll look at. So that's a total of, again, without breaks, 2 hours, 14 minutes, and then just under 100 questions. Something that, again, we can't really consider as we take the test, but just so you know, every section has 2 unmarked experimental questions that don't affect your score. So 2 questions that are going to be thrown out no matter what. But again, we just don't really know what those are and how that will affect the curve and all that. So we can't consider it too much. But just be aware, they used to have a whole experimental section, which wasn't very effective. And now they just embedded them into the sections themselves. So again, the timing with a 10-minute break between verbal and math. The ACT is actually changing as of September. So coming up in September, the ACT will change, but in its current form, this is way shorter. The ACT is over 3 hours. The SAT is, again, like 2+. And also the ACT is like very much a timed test and like a speed test. And the SAT used to be a little bit more of that. Now the amount of time per question is increased a lot. And so again, that's been a big boon to students. So let's talk content and strategies, starting with the verbal stuff. Although I will say that these strategies here apply to both. Active reading is different than it used to be, because it used to be pencil in hand, right? Starring, circling, underlining, making little notes in the passage. There is still some of that, like on math, you still want scratch paper and to draw things out for geometry, especially. But now it's more like there's a highlighter tool. Answer eliminator, I think, is going to be big. And you can kind of follow with your cursor. These are all tools that are really important to practice on the Blue Book app, which is free and available to everyone and just kind of logs you into your College Board account to do SAT practice and real tests. So definitely actively engage. Passive reading is more like kind of one here, one there, and then that, and then we're sunk. The Desmos calculator we'll talk about a lot. And then there's no guessing penalty. There are very few tests at all anymore where there's points off for wrong answers. So assuming it's multiple choice, you definitely don't want to leave it blank. If it's a math grid in and we guess, we're probably going to miss it. But let's say we're running out of time and there's 3 multiple choice questions left, just guess something. I recommend C just because you want to be consistent. If you guess C, 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 you're likely to get at least one of those right. If you Christmas tree it and go A, B, C, D, probably going to miss them all, just probability wise. So leave nothing blank. Even if you're running out of time, make sure you bubble something in. That's also a reason to skip forward on occasion to get to like the grammar questions or to prioritize low-hanging fruit that you know you can get rather than a question that's taking you forever or really proving difficult. Digging a little deeper, the average time per question is just over a minute, but not all questions are created equal. There'll be certain like command of evidence questions, for example, that take us a solid 2 minutes, and we still may not be sure. And then some grammar questions that, especially with practice, you can get just like that, 10 seconds. There used to be 4 passages with 10 questions each. Now, all short passages, just 1 question for each. That's a huge change from the olden days, like 2 years ago. And you can see an example here. It's on the left side. This is 2 vocabulary questions. And we'll look a little bit more in depth at that in a moment. But it's never going to be much more than this. The longest questions generally are like a big paragraph, a graph, and then the 4 choices can be long as well. So they cover a lot of ground, a lot of different types of material. I learned a lot of trivial facts just kind of teaching the SAT. But we don't have to spend a lot of time with each topic anymore. So here's what the blue book looks like. And the most important things that I want to point out. So this is what you would see like when you start a test, for example. You'll see number 1 would technically be a vocab question, not grammar. But the things I want to point out are the answer eliminator, the number 1 tool for verbal. You can click it and it'll engage for all questions. And then it just pulls up little like A, B, C, D circles with slashes through them. If you click that, it'll just eliminate an answer, right? And if you can click it again to bring it back if you want. So that's number 1. If we are struggling with the question, marking for review is a good idea. And this is an app that like you get on your computer, right? So some schools have installed it for students for the PSAT, but generally like one of the first things I'll do in a tutoring session is we'll want to go over a Blue Book SAT. I'll have someone take one of these. Mark for review allows us to then, when we move forward, you can click on this little bar at the bottom, the question 1 of 27, and that'll bring up all the questions, including a little red mark by the ones you've flagged. Those are the big things. Most people don't use the highlighter tool, which I think is okay. There are also plenty of different accommodations, right, for students with extra time or who get more breaks or dyslexia and so on. This is what we'll always start with is vocab and context. So for quite a while, like when I took the SAT dozens of years ago, there were analogies and vocabulary was a huge part of the test. Then for quite a while, it really wasn't very much. And now it is again, right? There are 4 questions approximately on each of module 1 and 2 that just test vocab and context. So if you're a really high scorer, vocabulary flashcards and just reviewing words and learning new words can be a way to improve your score. Strategy for these. I highly recommend covering the answers completely. So masking them as you read the passage. As you read the little blurb, then you predict a word or phrase. And if you can't, that's okay. So don't force it. Sometimes we just know if it's positive or negative or just kind of like the vibe. And then eliminate. So the process of elimination is huge on this test. And even the highest scoring test takers can benefit from doing this, being a bit more of a methodical, kind of scrupulous, good vocab word test taker. If you gravitate straight towards a good answer, if you're good at this stuff, you get it right more often than not. But if you want to be perfect, right, 10 for 10 consistently, I do think the process of elimination is important. Then let's say we're left with 2 good answers or maybe 2 answers, but we don't know the words perfectly. That's when you plug them back in, you analyze the word roots and just kind of do what you can, go with your gut, pick an answer and move on. Can't take more than about a minute on these because then you'll really be struggling for time at the end of the section. For those of you who are looking at this one, the answer is indeed B, because the author is frustrated with something. So it wouldn't be variety or precision, which are positive words, and then obscurity means something that's not very well known or kind of hard to access, and that doesn't work in context. So B is in boy for that. Then for my money, some of the hardest questions. These come in the form of literary like this, or graph questions, which we'll look at in a bit. And these would always show up between questions 5 to about 15. So that's the range that I tell a lot of people on module 2 upper level, be ready to skip forward. Right? If you read something and you have that feeling that we've all had of, gosh, I read this, but I have no idea what I just read, let me do it again. We don't really have time or energy for that. So to keep up your momentum and confidence, right, and just stay ahead of the time, it's often good to just like skip a question that you're struggling with. And then if you get to the grammar stuff, which is question 16 and beyond, then a lot of that's greener pastures, a lot quicker and easier for most. Here, the job is what it will be for all the long questions. So our strategy should be read the question, of course, read the passage to figure out, in this case, what is the claim, which is in the poem, the speaker compares the changes in the season to the attitude of his beloved. And then eliminate answers. And you only go through and take an answer out if you're sure it's wrong. If you're not sure, you're like, gosh, this is confusing, keep it. The worst thing we can do is cross out the right answer. So instead we look, and like a lot of people would look at A and say, okay, I'm out. I'm abandoning this question. Don't like this 17th century English. But some will look at that and say, all right, A definitely talks about the changes in the season, but I'm not sure I see any attitude of a person, a beloved, the person he loves. B, similarly, a lot about nature and changes in season, but nothing about an attitude of a person. I'd say C is probably that same problem, so I hope it's choice D. We don't pick it because we're there, but in this case, it would be. It's saying, nor hath the sun the power to melt that marble ice, which holds her heart congealed and makes her pity cold. So that sounds like they're talking about a person who is cold and can't even be swayed by the warm noonday sun. Do I understand the poem completely? No, but we don't need to have a pretty confident answer. Unlike on math, though, verbal is going to be like the least wrong choice a lot of times, whereas on math, we can really prove it. So that's a reason that some people like math more. In that same range, you'll see inference questions, which always have these 7 words. Which choice most logically completes the text? An inference is like a leap of judgment or something that you kind of can glean information from what you've read, but you do not want to assume very much. So my advice on these would be, the answer is going to be in the passage. It might not be super clear or obvious, but you're never going to pick an answer that's out of left field. These questions do tend to be tricky just because they're wordy, and sometimes the topic is not very interesting. Focusing on connector words, so like here, however, is a big one that I would always kind of make a note of and maybe even highlight in the blue book. There aren't any other big connectors here. And then if you find like a main idea, which is often either at the beginning or the end or both, highlight that as well. We'll maybe come back to a question like this. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But in the end here, the answer is B. So just wanted to note that because you can kind of see how here it says these things are commonplace, durable, versatile. And then they say that these new tests and these new, the new polyurethane, like bio-based foams, the new bio-based alternative, sorry, has been good. They can recycle it. So we've got this part down. It can recycle, right, and doesn't have the harmful chemicals necessarily. But the question would still be, are they as varied and as durable as polyurethane foams? So it is something that's pretty much in the passage, you can see. And then these questions are at the very end, so kind of jumping ahead because before you get to rhetoric, there'll be grammar. But these are what we call the bullet point questions. You'll have a question that always says which choice uses relevant information to accomplish a goal. And for these, the trick is you barely ever need the bullet points. So you can basically block out the left side of the page and just say, all right, what is my job? I want to introduce the research of Aubrey and Schmidt to an audience already familiar with global warming, but really I want to introduce the research of Aubrey and Schmidt. So we could cross out A and D pretty fast because it doesn't even mention those two people. So that would be a poor introduction. And then if you're already familiar with global warming, B is not great and it doesn't really introduce the research very well or until at the end. So this one would be pretty easy to go to C as in cat without using the bullets. If you have multiple good answers, you check those, and there can be hard ones, especially these days are doing that a little more. But these are questions you want to make sure you get to. Just because they are last does not mean we want to finish with those. That would be a big mistake, right? If time is running out and we're finishing here and have to guess, that's probably throwing away a pretty easy point, as opposed to if you had to run out of time on this one, oh well. And then what I think is honestly probably the most important thing to prepare for, because a lot of people are throwing away very easy points, is the grammar stuff. Specifically clauses and punctuation. I'll just leave this up for a minute. You can see like a couple rules that you may know but are very good to have written out and well defined. There will usually be 3 to 5 clauses questions per section. So they test commas and periods and semicolons a lot. On the SAT, with one exception, periods are semicolons. So if you see them both and nothing else has changed around them, both those answers would be wrong. They both have to separate 2 full sentences. Commas are tough. They can do a lot of things. So commas are really like not ideal to test until you have to. A lot of people think they know how to use them and don't very well. And we also overuse commas, which the test writers know. And the SAT writers also know that people use colons pretty much only for lists. So I would guess you're not going to see that in the SAT. Think of a colon as a drum roll, please. Has to come after a full sentence. So here I had one great passion in life. Drum roll, please. What was it? Making pizzas or eating pizza. It could be a list, but more often it will introduce an independent clause, a dependent clause, or just a word or two. So definitely just kind of going back to basics and making sure I know really well what a semicolon, what a period, what a colon does, and what they cannot do. And what commas can't do, which is separate 2 independent clauses. That'd be a run-on or comma splice. They test that a lot as well. Because there are certain levels of, I guess, ease to the rules, I recommend testing the answers in the following order. So grammar questions, you're always going to look at the answers first to see if they're testing verb tense or pronouns or possession or clauses. If you looked at A and B first, you could immediately say, well, unless it's that weird exception, which is just like a bunch of semicolons in a list, probably A and B are identical and therefore both wrong. They can't both be right and they're identical, so A and B are out right away. Then if there are colons, I would test those because there's a pretty definite rule of full independent clause before, introduction after. Colons are often correct on this test. Then dashes, if you see one, you really need a second one more often than not. Then answers with no punctuation, and finally commas if you have to. But commas are tricky. So like here, if I knew it wasn't A or B, I'd go to C. Not saying it's more likely to be right or not, but easier to test. So Beatrix Potter is perhaps best known for writing and illustrating children's books such as The Tale of Peter Rabbit, but she also dedicated herself to mycology, the study of fungi, producing more than 350 paintings of the fungal species she observed in nature and submitting her blah, blah, blah. Hopefully we hear the error there and see that we need a pause. We would then test D, and you can make the comma pause extra long, right? If it's right, it'll still sound fine. So she also dedicated herself to mycology, this is choice D, the study of fungi, producing more than 350 paintings. That is a new idea. It requires a pause. It just can't be a period or semicolon, but it also can't be C. So D, as in dog, would definitely be our answer for 21. And this order and going to the answer choices first is absolutely the way to go on grammar. You don't want to find yourself reading the passage and then thinking, oh, wait, what am I even looking for? Then the other big one is connector questions. This is going to be between the grammar and the rhetoric. So before the bullet point questions, but after several grammar questions, you're going to see, again, 3 or 4 connectors per section. My notes at the bottom are for people just to know that however and nevertheless are identical, both punctuation and grammar and logically, I should say. And same with therefore, thus, hence, and consequently, which people think is negative sometimes, but consequently just means this thing led to the other. It's cause effect. Not all consequences are bad. So with these, I'd look at the choices and then read the passage to decide, are these ideas contrasting or similar? Here, there's evolution, surprising adaptations to ensure survival, tadpole shrimp embryos, blank, can pause development for over 10 years. Well, that sounds like an example of evolution and adaptation. So not A or C, those are contrast words, and not consequently because it's not one thing leading to the other, it's just an iteration, an example of the first sentence. So that one would be B, and most people will feel pretty good about that. And then last question type before we move into math. These can be pretty easy on module 1 and sometimes very, very hard on module 2. For these graph questions, you start by reading the question. It's kind of counterintuitive. And then you read the passage. And only then do we go from answers to graph. Sometimes 3 of the choices will just be false, especially on module 1, just like looking at it and be like, that's not true. But more often they'll all be true, and we need to pick the one that's logical and relevant. These are the one opportunity on verbal, especially where you can be a bit of a perfectionist, meaning you don't want to settle for an answer that's like, oh yeah, I could see that. It's got to be perfectly true in the graph and perfectly relevant to the passage or the conclusion. And these just kind of come throughout also in the middle of each section. They're command of evidence technically, but just only some of them have graphs. You'll see a few per section. So again, I'll open it up for questions at the end, but want to make sure I get to math. Let's talk format for the math sections. 2 35-minute modules, 22 per module, about 1.5 minutes per question, but some will be just very, very quick and easy, like almost alarmingly so. And some will be harder, especially towards the end of each module. The old paper SAT was very much word heavy, lots of word problems. For international students and students with English as a second language, this is part of why they changed it. The digital SAT is now much more approachable because it's more of a mathy math test, pure math, common core stuff, mostly algebra. Don't forget that there are geometry formulas provided. Those are on the left here. Special right triangles, 3D volume, area, circumference, Pythagoras, and even some rules about radians and degrees. So just knowing that they're there, I think is important. There's a little button on the top of the Blue Book app, like when you're doing questions, that will open up that reference sheet. Most of the questions, about 18 out of 22 will be multiple choice, but then 4 per section will be grid-ins, student produced or free response questions. You can put in anything from 0 to 9, a fraction symbol is a slash, a decimal or a negative, but that's it. 5 characters for a positive answer, up to 6 for negative. And then if it's a mixed fraction, like 3 1/2, put 3.5 or 7/2, because 3, 1/2 would read as 31 halves. I prefer fractions. I feel like they're more just definite and reliable, but if you're doing a decimal and it doesn't fit, don't round off, just stop at the final spot, right? So if it's 3.1875432, just type in 3.8175 until you've run out of space. And every test actually has the instructions right here. As soon as you see a grid in, that'll pop up. So like you should not have to look at this or waste time on test day, but here you can see acceptable and unacceptable ways to enter answers. You also have to simplify. So like if you had 4/6, that won't work. You got to simplify it to 2/3. Here's what that math stuff looks like. And the biggest things are on the top right. So as I mentioned, the reference sheet, but then also this calculator. This is like absolute game changer. People who can use that Desmos graphing calculator effectively can do the vast majority of the questions on it with very little energy or effort expended. For example, if I see equivalent, sorry, this is a bit distorted. The image got a little bit smushed. But if I see this equivalent, I mean, people are going to do the factoring and that's fine. But if we've forgotten, you could just punch this right into Desmos. So the original x squared plus 5x minus 50, it'll graph a parabola and then test the answers to see which one is the same parabola. It's not very mathy, but it's effective. It's pretty quick and it avoids any chance of careless errors. This answer is C for those of you trying it. You can also mark for review or answer eliminate, but I feel like the answer eliminator is much less effective than it would be on verbal. So calculator, reference sheet, those are the big ones. Here's what you see when you click the calculator. So the first is the one on the left. And then if you hit expand, then you get the thing on the right, which is a little bit funky because it covers the question. You have to kind of move it around. So that's more if you just need a little bit more space to look at the graph. And then within the calculator, we'll talk about a few things you can do. It can do like everything. Cube roots, percent, mean, median, mode, typing in points to get an equation. Like it really is a cheat code. And so I've had to switch my teaching style a lot because it used to be, yep, let's do the math. Let's find a common denominator. And now it's just like, let's add them on Desmos and hit the fraction button. Right. But there is an art to that. So as I mentioned, Game Changer has fundamentally changed the experience of taking this test. You can and should bring your own calculator. So just having your TI 83 or 84, as most people have, or any like scientific calculator, definitely can bring it. It's effective for like some trig stuff, for example, sine, cosine, tangent, making sure you're in degree mode. But the Desmos calculator is right there on the screen. It's right by the questions. It really is just absolutely huge to know how to use it and use it well. So if you had, a couple of things you were doing as like we don't cram for the SAT, but just to study in a few days, learning how to use Desmos would probably be number one. And then number two would be the punctuation rules. That's what I'd recommend. So things we can do, and we're going to practice with that in a minute. You can plug in equations and see where they intersect. So just taking away steps like combining terms or distributing or foiling or factoring. We don't really have to do much of that anymore. You still can, but then you run the risk of flipping a negative sign or a fraction. And it's not just the hard stuff. A lot of the really easy questions, I'm encouraging like my students who know how to do it like the back of their hand to still do it on Desmos, just to make sure that we're not making any careless errors, leaving nothing behind. But being fluid and fluent with Desmos is really essential these days. And most of my students have used it in some regard, especially if they're into like the pre-calc stuff. But they also think they know like every aspect of it, and a vast majority do not. I've had a few students who are real experts, but most people can really benefit from like a quick tutorial. The content distribution, just old paper SAT for reference, it's now 70% algebra, because algebra and advanced math are both algebra 1 and then 2. And then about 15% stats, which is mostly like mean, median, mode, and line of best fit, margin of error, little things. And then 15% geometry trig, which does get a lot of people, because if you're taking it as a junior or senior and you didn't have geometry, or you had it in like freshman year, we've forgotten a lot of it. And some geometry teachers, aren't amazing. It depends on the teacher a lot. What was cut most, as you can see from the old test, is the stats. So probability, basic stats, all that. And they replaced it with just more algebra, not word problems, but really algebra heavy stuff. X's and Y's and graphing and parabolas and polynomials. The overarching strategy for math would be read the question, make sure you know what you're solving for. So always be asking, what am I solving for? Then what do I know and how do I, like, what do I need? Right? So plan your attack. Is it writing out an equation? Do I just graph it? Something else? Then do the math, right? So don't skip steps. If we're showing work and writing it out by hand, which sometimes is still needed, make sure you're writing that down. They'll provide scratch paper on test day. And then double check, right? What if accidentally I solved for X and I was supposed to solve for Y, right? So that would be throwing away easy points. Always make sure quickly that you answer the right thing, right? Or if like you're solving for an angle measure and it's acute, it looks like that, and then you got an answer that's like 25, or sorry, obtuse, and you got 25 and you know it's more than 90, for example, that would be a red flag and be like, wait a second, I must have gone wrong somewhere. So it does have to be logical. And even though they say shapes aren't drawn to scale, they pretty much are. A little more here. I mentioned some of these steps, but I have all my students kind of make sure that they are aware and ready to use all 5 of these, which is truly basic algebra. Isolating a variable, combining terms, things we've been doing for years, factoring or foiling, which most people call factoring, distributing, and then substitution is probably number 1. Substitute coordinate points or a value for A or B and so on. If none of those work, or let's say we don't have an obvious first step like that, look at the answers. Sometimes that's helpful. Sometimes picking numbers is the way to go. And do not forget about Desmos because, again, it's just the solution method for most of these questions at this point. I mentioned working backwards. So this is now maybe less of a thing than it used to be because of Desmos. But looking at this question, the answers are very approachable. The question is, which of the following values of X is not a solution of the inequality? Well, you can graph this. So if you put it in exactly as it is in the Desmos calculator, you would get a shaded region, and you could just see which of these X's is not in the shaded region. But I will say here, it makes sense to plug in like 3 or -9 and just test which one of these like does and doesn't work. And I think in this case, 3 definitely works because it's 12 is greater than 1, which where I come from is true. So then my guess would be probably -9 is the one that doesn't, right? Just by logic going to the lowest number. And that would tell you if you plugged it in and did the math and wrote it out, -24 is greater than -23. I have to think about that for a second, but it's not true. -23 is closer to 0 and therefore greater. But I do think in the end, this is probably now a Desmos question. And some people just want to do the math, which is also okay, right? We have options on these. And this would be one where, just looking at those answers, they're not quite as friendly. And so because of that, maybe I'd pick a number, or again, maybe put in Desmos. But here it says every 12 hours, the number of virions grown doubles. So exponential modeling tells us if there's 100,000 to start, it's going to have to be C or D, not A or B. A or B starts with 2 and grows by a factor of 100,000 every however often. And then if I wanted to test C or D, well, I know if one day, if it doubles every 12 hours, in one day when T is 1, this doubling should happen twice. So if I plugged in 1, I want to know which of these would give me an exponent of 2. That is choice D, which says 100,000 is doubled twice per day, every 12 hours. What choice C says, and this is not common knowledge, but what choice C says is every 12 days. If you plugged in 12 days, the exponent would be 1. So it doubles once every dozen days. That's not what we're asked for. I would say graphing this, there is an option as well. You'd have to kind of look at what the strategy is and what you're looking for, but Desmos could be helpful on this question too. All right, last little thing here, which is going to take us a bit, is reviewing the content areas and then some example problems. And then we'll just practice or show you how to use Desmos a little bit more clearly with a few sample questions. Basic algebra, 35% of the questions. So this is a huge amount of the points on the SAT math. This is y equals mx plus b, or sometimes just x equals, and just isolating or combining. Functions, so knowing your x's and your y's, of what's in parentheses and what's not. And then systems of linear equations, which is a big old Desmos thing, as well as inequalities, which we've already seen. This stuff was, generally algebra 1, so people haven't thought about it in a long time. And if we try the steps, we might mess it up. So a combination of knocking off rust and then learning how to use the calculator. Here are a couple examples that you would see. I'll just leave them up for a minute. We're not going to do these ones, but just want to show you what's up with that. So I think just as a note, the way I would do the left one would be put it in Desmos and see how many times those things intersect. Solutions to a system of equations would just be how many times these two lines, one on the left, one on the right, how many times they cross. And unless they're same slope, they would cross once. In this case, I think they would be the same slope. And then for the one on the right, that's a little trickier. You just have to read it and look at what does y relate to. It's the residence area. And so it would end up being B or D. And then I plug in numbers to kind of determine, all right, if I plug in 0 and 1 and 2 for y, what am I actually doing? In that case, the answer should have been B as in boy. So A for number 1 on the left, B for the other one. Not important, just looking at the question types you're going to see though. Then there's a lot of advanced math, which is also algebra 2 mostly. So this is equivalent expressions, equivalent being a magic word to go to Desmos. Exponents and roots, quadratics, so factors and x-intercepts and solutions. Exponential growth and decay, absolute value, which is Desmos. And then radicals, like we mentioned, and rational stuff. That doesn't come up all that often. Here are a couple examples of what you would see for these. And for these on the left, you'd want to just see, all right, I got to isolate 3k minus 2. So just taking, I think this I'd do by hand, multiply the fraction, both sides by the denominator, then divide by 3n, and we should just get choice D. There's less math than people think. The one on the right is super common, and it's almost like physics-y, so some people remember this from school in a different context. But again, what am I solving for? In this case, the height from which the ball was dropped. Well, that's when t is 0. That means it's been 0 seconds since it was dropped. So my answer would be 600. That's the y-intercept. Right? We could graph that for further confirmation, but 600 would be a pretty easy answer there. Then we mentioned 15% are problem solving and data analysis, so statistics. But this also includes probability, ratios, proportions, percent, and then like things like a box plot, just maybe look up like what that is and what each part of it means. Much more rare. They say 20%, but I think it's probably more like 15. Doesn't happen very often. These are 2 examples. On the left, you can literally type in 124800 with no commas. Desmos doesn't love commas. 124800 equals X percent of, it'll give you the word of when you type percent, 160000. Right? Just looking at it, we know it's going to be C or D. And then the one on the right, broken record, but you can type in mean and put these in parentheses. There we would use the commas. Or you can just kind of look at it and see these are the same numbers, but data set S has one low outlier. Therefore, the answer would be B. The average of data set S is lower than T. A lot of them are this simple, but if you haven't seen stats or done this, in a while or ever, then they'll be tricky. And then final category is geometry trig, which is a lot of people's least favorite and the scariest for many. Lines, angles, especially right triangles, so Pythagoras, but also the special right triangles, SOHCAHTOA, and then perimeter, area, and volume. Remember those formulas and make sure you draw it out would be my guidance on geometry. And here's two examples. And these we definitely don't have time to teach fully, but you can see the left one is our first free response grid in question. And it'd be about drawing out the right triangle and doing Pythagoras or seeing if there's a special right triangle involved, and then maybe simplifying. The one on the right is about alternate interior, alternate exterior. And so knowing that like Z and Y are equal, and X plus Y or X plus Z would be 180. And from there, we've got enough to solve. The hardest questions on geometry would be three-dimensional volume. So if they say like right rectangular prism, knowing that that's a box, not a pyramid, or like slant height of a cone or pyramid, those can be super hard. So the thing I want to spend our last 5-10 minutes on before opening up for questions is just a little bit more insight, because I keep saying Desmos, and you can practice at desmos.com/graphing, I believe it is. But like just an insane amount of things. You can create tables. You can just find the solution by graphing it. You can calculate it. Functions are super huge. You can shift graphs. So let's just look at a few examples and how we might use Desmos. Here's a classic. 6x plus 10y is 60, 9x minus 5y is 30. They say there's a solution, xy point. We want the value of y. So in the past, I might have said, let's isolate and substitute, right? Get rid of x in the equation. Or let's use elimination, right? Let's get it so these two equations kind of look the same. We can take away one of those variables. But both of those now are not smart ways to do it. They take longer. You might have a careless mistake. Even if you badly want to do the math, do this. First expression is the first line. Second is the second line. One's red, one's blue. They cross. And the y coordinate of the point of intersection is 3. Our answer is 3. That will take 10, 20 seconds. The biggest risk you run is typing something in incorrectly. But if you don't, we've got our answer just laid out. And then just knowing that if it's a solution to a system, that's always a point of intersection, which is different if we're talking about like a parabola, for example, or one equation. So easy as can be. Then quadratics. So you've got 2x squared plus x minus 21. Not the easiest thing to factor if we had to, because of the 2 leading coefficient. It says the function has zeros, so x-intercepts at points A and B. What is the length of the line segment AB? Well, I don't relish the idea of trying to find this by hand, so we just graph it. Don't need to put y equals, don't need to put equals 0, don't need to put f of x, just 2x squared plus x minus 21. Then click on the zeros, they'll pop up like this, and you just find the distance. 3 minus negative 3.5 is 6.5. Our answer would be C, 6.5. So can make it look super easy, is pretty easy, but you do have to practice a bit to get comfortable with that, especially in the blue book setting, just moving the calculator around, expanding, collapsing, and so on. And then functions. So there's a bunch of ways we could do this one. The question is, which table gives 3 values of x and their corresponding values of h of x, which is y, for the given function? And here, I'm looking at these answers. A lot of them have some similarities. But again, Desmos. And this is kind of an insane trick. But if you type table, first off, they type the equation already because it's provided. But if you just type a table of points, there will be a thing that pops up right here that just lets you do a regression. which means it'll give you, if it's linear, an equation of a line is the first option. But if you know it's a parabola, there's quadratic regression, and it will legitimately just write the equation for you. So it really can't emphasize enough how easy that becomes. Here, if you type the equation and then table, it'll show you exactly like the points that are on this graph. Right, and so then we can see it's negative 1, 5, and it's 2, 14. So that means it's got to be B. That's the one that has negative 1, 5, and 2, 14. Right, so many ways we could do that, but this table thing is one of the biggest tricks and shortcuts. And then systems of inequalities. So this one's actually harder because you got to write out the system. One of our last practice questions here. So we budgeted 100,000 to purchase laptops and tablets for a school, but got to purchase a minimum of 150 tablets. Then they give you the cost for both and want to know the maximum number of laptops. And we can't break the laptops in half, so it's got to be an integer number, a whole number. So we'd have to take some time here and do a money inequality and then a tablet laptop inequality. That would look like this. X is greater than or equal to 150 was we have to have 150 tablets or more. And the other one's just the dollar amount. And so here, if we were solving for Y, which is laptops, it would be 102, because again, we can't get 102.3 laptops. That makes no sense. So to stay within budget, but also to get 150 tablets, the most laptops the administrator can buy is 102, and that would be your answer. That's probably the hardest question we've done. And so if you feel a little bit lost there, I would not be alarmed. It's just something you can like work with and practice a bit, and then you'll feel better. So to recap for math, answer what the question is asking, right? What am I solving for? Make sure you get that. Don't sleep on details. They're giving you information. It's usually for a reason. Leave nothing blank unless you have to. And then skip around. I mean, I think this is more of a thing for verbal, but if you're stuck on trigonometry or something that you just know that you're not going to get quickly, mark it for review and move on to something different. They do tend to get harder as they go in the section, but there's overlap, and what's hard for one person might not be hard for you. And then just know there's usually a simple solution between your calculator, Desmos, the formulas. There's usually a very easy way to solve. So how to practice? I mean, I saw some questions already pop up about like how to study for vocab, which I mentioned, just flashcards. There's plenty of little sites that have commonly used SAT words. But really the practice that you should do is tests, taking tests, reviewing tests by yourself or with a tutor. Right, a lot of what I do tutor full time. And so a lot of what I'm doing is just working through mock test results and then developing a plan based on that with the student. And like, we have a ton of great tutors. So definitely that's an option. You can request to work with an individual directly. We have many great tutors, both in person in certain locations and remote. I do all online. Alpha has 4 SATs that are digital and adaptive. The nice thing about those is they generate immediate great score reports, so you can see which questions and which question types you missed and then work through them. And then College Board has 7 Blue Book SATs on the app itself and 3 digital PSATs, which is something some people are working towards. If you're a junior, you'll see that in October. Those are the best resources out there. You can take them, you can retake them, but really just treasuring those and doing the timing aspect and just the practice invaluable. That's all I've got today. This number or emailing info@alparuth.com is if you're interested in tutoring or test prep or executive functioning coaching, which is more about prioritization and planning as you enter the school year. I'm going to launch one last poll, and I'm going to open it up for questions and answer the ones that are already there. Oops, wrong one. And then let's launch this new. So yeah, if you have questions, please type them in. If you feel like you've gotten enough out of this, hopefully it was helpful. You can also call it an evening, but we've got 5 minutes or so for some questions. Here's that last poll. All right, so first question I see is, well, two questions about the recording. As I mentioned, I believe they send these out on Friday, so check your email. If you're registered for this presentation, you'll receive a copy of the recording. But generally on Fridays is when they send them out. Same would be for the ACT presentation that I'll be doing tomorrow. Next question is, which module or modules would the experimental questions be on? All of them. They are embedded in every single section. We never know where they are. I can't really predict them or do much different, but you'll see them. There are experimental questions that don't count on every single section, just 2 questions per section. Someone asked, could I explain dependent versus independent clause? Sure. I run, I eat. This is proper grammar because it's 2 independent clauses, subject and a verb, separated by a period. If I add something like while I run, I guess I don't recommend this in practice, I would change it to a comma because now I've made this clause dependent. Dependent just means it cannot stand alone. So it may have a subject and a verb, but this also has a fragment maker. And then independent can stand alone, subject, verb. So as simple as I eat, right? Or it is raining outside, that would be independent. Independent means a full sentence, dependent means it's not. Next question is, I'm taking the practice SAT on Saturday. Is it worth taking the Blue Book practice before then? It depends on like where you're at. If you're someone who like really wants to perform strongly on the practice test on Saturday, then I think the Blue Book SAT and review would be immensely helpful. But also it's a practice test, so this weekend could be used for that same purpose. So you could do the practice SAT and Alperuth and then a Blue Book after. So I wouldn't say you have to, but maybe just do a little bit of review before on like clauses and certain math things you've forgotten, just so you're not like in summer mode, you're more in SAT mode. Two more I see good ones. One is, will we be able to go back and forth between questions in the SAT? Yes, not sections, but questions. So once you're done with section 1, the time's up and you're on to section 2. But within section 2, you can go anywhere in the 27 questions. And you should skip from like question 8 to about 16 to go to get the grammar stuff first or early. Yeah, good question. Next is, our Alperuth SAT mocks the same as official practice SATs on the Blue Book? They are not. The Alperuth tests are 4 tests that I think are maybe a little bit harder than Blue Book on average. The platform isn't the same. It's similar, but you can launch like a separate Desmos tab. It's not built in. And the answer eliminator is just like a little bit different. But there are 4 different tests, which is nice because there aren't that many SAT test resources out there. So the Blue Book has 7, and then Alperuth has 4. 2 questions about grammar, and then I think we're going to be pretty close to the end here. One is, could you explain the list on how to answer test questions for grammar? Yeah, the strategy is look at the answers to determine what's being tested, and then use elimination. But you do need to look at the rules. So this kind of dovetails into the next question, which is there ever a question that comes down to semicolons and periods? The answer is actually yes. So I said they're identical with one exception. If you saw an answer with a period and an answer with a semicolon and nothing else has changed around them, they're both wrong unless the passage has a bunch of semicolons that separate items in a list. That would be the exception that would say period doesn't work, but semicolon does. Haven't seen that all that often, but that definitely is a thing. So yeah, the general rule for grammar is use the answer choices to your full advantage, determine what they're testing, and then eliminate. And the last 2 as we close up here, recommendations for resources to learn Desmos. There are a ton online, but I would actually just like first go in and just play around with it. And then I don't have like a specific like Reddit or YouTube thread, but I'm sure there are. If you just Google like Desmos tips, tricks, I'm sure there are some. There's going to be plenty. So yeah. And then Finally, the Blue Book app is something to download. So you have to like you go online, Google SAT Blue Book. It'll be an app you download. And if you have extra time, generally the extra time is time and a half. And so that would be like instead of 35 minutes, you'd have 52 point something. So that's the usual extended time. But sorry, going back to this, that's the usual extended time. And some people have double times or added breaks and so on. Cool. These are all good questions. We do have to wrap up today. So again, thank you for joining. Hopefully it was helpful. I just went back to this slide because someone asked. Someone asked about Khan Academy. Very good. I would start with the Blue Book and the Appleruth test probably. And the Appleruth book that we have is very good as well. But if you're not doing tutoring, Khan Academy is a good supplement for sure. I just got to be careful that they're testing stuff that's current because sometimes they have like older things that aren't. Again, wish I could answer all the questions. They've been very good. Thank you guys for coming. Hope you got a lot out of it. And yeah, have a great rest of your evening.